Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I did while I was at Stanford in Rob Jackson's group on the FLUXNet methane synthesis activity. So data-driven modeling of wetland methane fluxes from the site level to the globe. And as I said, I'm now based at UIC and continuing a thread of this research. I'm very happy to talk more with any of you about this topic if you're interested in the machine learning or the methane side. So big picture, why do we care about methane? And really, these beautiful NASA visualizations are sort of deceptive in that they do reflect our ability to monitor concentrations of methane in the atmosphere. So you can see these plumes of methane in places like South Asia. But they're deceptive in that they belie the fact that we don't actually really know how to account for all the sources and sinks of methane in the global methane budget. And this is kind of concerning because of recent trends in the global methane cycle, in the global methane burden. So if you'll see here you'll see here on the left, the increase in atmospheric methane concentrations over the last 30 years or so. We had a period of kind of a plateau in the early 2000s, a phase of renewed growth after 2007, and then a phase of accelerated growth, which we're still currently in. And particularly concerning in the last year, we had the highest ever recorded increase in atmospheric methane concentrations of about 15 parts per billion in a single year. And so these are concerning trends because our understanding of the methane budget is incomplete, and we could say the methane budget is not closed if we were to extend the analogy there. So this is the most recent global methane budget put together by the Global Carbon Project, which Rob Jackson chairs. And on the left in orange, you can see the major anthropogenic sources. On the right, you can see in green the major, the natural sources and sinks of methane. And what's notable is that there are kind of two sets of uncertainties here. So for each of these sources and sinks, there are two numbers. The number on the left reflects ensembles of bottom-up models that are primarily using process understanding to extrapolate methane flux predictions globally. And then on the right is the top-down estimate from an ensemble of inversion modeling schemes that take atmospheric observations and then try to back out what the sources must be. And so you can see there's a disagreement between the bottom-up and the top-down ensemble estimates. And then in these parentheses below, there's also uncertainty within each of those estimates, and sometimes they're overlapping and sometimes they're not. And so in particular, one of the largest uncertainties in the budget is that for the natural source of wetlands. And so you'll see here we have a range of 149 for the bottom-up estimate to 181 teragrams of methane per year. And then there's almost 50, plus or minus 50% spread within each of these ensemble estimates. And so yeah, this increase in this accelerating increase in atmospheric methane is concerning, but it's also puzzling in that we can't really account for because the methane budget is not closed, we can't really account for and attribute the cause of this rise in atmospheric methane. And so there's been an interest in, so among these two flavors of methane modeling, what's missing actually is ground truth surface measurements. And so the main thrust of FLUXNet-Methane has been to compile available ground surface measurements of methane fluxes and try to bring them into the global methane modeling community's work. And so to talk about this more, we really have to think about, what is FLUXNet-Methane? So stepping back, we can look at the global FLUXNet network. And so this represents a network of hundreds of sites of scientists around the world who are making measurements using a technique called eddy covariance. And as you see, there's a little cartoon of eddy covariance on the bottom left. And so this is an ecosystem exchange measurement approach that utilizes very high frequency measurements of vertical wind speed and atmospheric scalars like CO2, methane, water vapor concentrations. And with those high frequency measurements, we can build a statistical description of near surface turbulence, essentially the vertical motion of the air. And over half-hourly or hourly periods, we can integrate these values to estimate an average flux or exchange between the biosphere and the atmosphere. And so this is the general approach that's being used, and it's to some extent emerged as a gold standard for ecosystem scale fluxes of energy and matter. And so this map is showing the global flux, all of the registered sites in the global FLUXNet network. And these sites include, are not just methane measuring sites, they're including sites that are measuring only water vapor and CO2 exchanges. So it's, if we look at the overall network, it's very extensive, and there are many sites where we have records more than 20 years long. And so in the last 10 years or so, the ability to make surface measurements of methane fluxes in particular has really improved. So you'll see in each of these images this similar tall, large vertical sensor. But this is an open path methane analyzer, so it's generating a very long absorption path length with a laser system. It's bouncing off a mirror a bunch of times. And we're able to then get those high frequency methane measurements with relatively lower power requirements. And this technological development has led to the proliferation of methane measurements across this FLUXNet network. And so we're seeing a rapid growth in the availability of these data sets. And naturally, since we know wetlands are areas where we're going to expect higher emissions, that's where most of the sites, most of these sensors have been situated. So on the top left, we have a bog, on top right, rice paddy, lower left, a marshland in California, pretty close to Stanford, and then lower right, a wet tundra in Alaska. So these are some of the characteristic sites for methane measurements now. And some of the advantages of these measurements is that they are capturing what we might call an ecosystem scale flux. So the exact footprint of what a eddy covariance tower sees varies depending on the wind direction and speed. But we can use modeling approaches to estimate roughly the patch or the fetch of the tower. So it's the area that we're actually measuring the fluxes over. And that's something on the order of tens to hundreds, maybe thousands of meters of a footprint. So at that scale, we're actually starting to capture something that's potentially valuable for larger scale modeling. And then the other, I would say even perhaps greater advantage of eddy covariance is the richness of the data in the temporal domain. And this becomes particularly important for something like methane, because methane fluxes kind of contain signals at so many different timescales. They're notoriously dynamic and heterogeneous, and these temporal dynamics can be decomposed using approaches like wavelet decomposition shown on the right. So here on the lower panel, we have the extremely variable half-hourly methane fluxes at a site in, I think this is the site in the California Delta. And then we see that signal being decomposed at first multi-day cycles of variability, and then DL, and then hourly at the top. And we can explore which drivers are driving the variability at each of these timescales. So multi-day tends to be driven by synoptic weather events. DL patterns can be the opening and closing of stomata. Once we get down to hourly, it's harder to distinguish this variability from noise. But it's a very, very rich signal. So definitely in the realm of big data for machine learning approaches. And maybe just to visually illustrate that expansion in methane, the sites here registered in the AmeriFlux network in yellow were all registered after December 2017. So AmeriFlux made, around the same time that we were launching the FLUXNet methane synthesis, AmeriFlux made a push on methane called the Year of Methane Action Team Year. And as a result, we were able to add, double the number of sites in the AmeriFlux network that are actively measuring and contributing data, which include methane fluxes. And so it's like, you'll see that there's this, something that will recur later in the talk is this biased towards the US in particular, and then also North America. But we do have a couple of sites now in Peru and Brazil. And so, while I was at Stanford, we got together a group of postdocs, primarily under the leadership of Rob Jackson and also Ben Poulter at NASA Goddard, who had acquired some funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to bring together a FLUXNet methane to try to compile the available eddy covariance methane data. And it really was a community effort with several postdocs who've now moved on to various different positions. Zuto, I believe, is still involved with Meta and has been working on a rice methane synthesis associated with this data set. We also had some pretty exciting collaborative efforts. So Rob established a partnership with Andrew Ng in computer science and contributed a project to the AI for climate change activity that they have. So we work primarily with Jeremy Urban and Sharon Zhu, who were graduate students in his lab. And we'll talk a little bit about the work that we did with them. But yeah, we also involved partnerships with FLUXNet, AmeriFlux, and we got some funding from the USGS Powell Synthesis Center to actually take the data set that we built and then do some synthesis work with it. So the resulting data set from the synthesis activity was published in 2021 by Cal Delwish, who's the lead author, and it contains 81 sites and 254 site years of data. And we have fairly good geographic coverage with at least one site in each major continent and a wide range of terrestrial ecosystem classes. So all of the major wetland classes, bogs, fens, marshes, and so on, and then also some upland sites, so some forests and agricultural fields, where we're still interested in the methane fluxes, even though they may not be the large fluxes. So this data set is now available and very accessible on the fluxnet.org website. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of different machine learning applications from this data set. The first of these is gap filling. And so this work has been published already in the journal Agricultural and Forest Meteorology. And gap filling is an imputation process. So it's the statistical process to replace missing data with substituted values. So it's very much suited to machine learning models. And the purpose of this is that we have a lot of gaps in the eddy covariance data that we're getting at these sites. And if we want to understand the drivers of methane flux or quantify annual site level budgets, we need to fill these time series accurately and be able to do that across a large number of sites. And so the goal here was really to develop a machine learning approach to gap fill these data sets in a way that would generalize across these different site conditions. And up until the point that we were doing this project, there are clear standards for CO2 flux gap filling that explored machine learning methods in the 2000s. And there's been a little bit of application to methane in 2014, but it was really just focused on a few high latitude sites where the fluxes follow a pretty predictable seasonal cycle, and it's a really limited latitudinal range. So I just wanted to show a couple of figures of what these data sets look like. So this is 1 week of data from the marsh that I showed you in the Delta, and you'll see that this site is actually one of the best sites in the data set in terms of data coverage, because it gets very regular onshore breeze winds that develop in California pretty much every day in the summer. And that steady wind results in very good data sets. But we still have data loss, especially at night. You'll see here, these nighttime values are often dropping off. And again, you see this scatter, that there's a lot of variability in the fluxes. If we zoom out to 1 month, again, you can see these maybe diurnal patterns of data loss, and still kind of maybe starting to see more of a seasonal signal coming in with an increase as we move into the summer. And then if you zoom out to an entire year, it actually becomes quite difficult to see the missing data at this scale. But we have about 60% data coverage at this site, which is really, really good for one of the FLUXNet methane sites. But certainly, you could imagine, given the variability here, that it might be hard to gap fill accurately. And I guess one natural question is, does it really matter if we does it matter how we gap fill these data sets? And I guess I would like to illustrate a little bit here that it probably does. So this is the cumulative flux that we could compute by iteratively summing the fluxes, the half-hourly fluxes throughout the year. And the spread that you see in the resulting annual sum is maybe the average here. This average in the middle is maybe 58 or something grams of methane per meter squared per year. And the spread here represents the spread that we get if we fill either with the median daily value, the 75th percentile, or the 95th percentile of the median observed values. And so I guess my point here is that if we use a naive gap filling approach and there's some bias associated with that, even within 1 or 2 standard deviations of the average, we can get something like 10 or 20% error on or 10 or 20% difference in the final annual sum, which could make a difference when we're trying to scale these values to the globe. So for our study, we wanted to capture a geographic range and a wide variety of wetland conditions. So we picked 17 sites that had a wide range of bioclimatic conditions and also data coverage, and one of every major wetland type that we were interested in. So this figure shows the data coverage, the availability of data at each of these sites. So on the x-axis here is the day of the year, the average day of the year. So we were averaging across multiple years where we had them. And then on the y-axis, we have the average methane data coverage, or the available observations per day. So a solid bar from the bottom to the top implies that on average, we have 100% data coverage on that day. You can see that US MYB, which is the marsh I was just discussing, has pretty good coverage, so 55% throughout the year. And you'll see in the summertime, when we have the steady onshore breezes, we're getting well over 50% data coverage each day. Whereas the lighter gray colors are showing long gaps. So in this site US UAF, which is in Alaska, we lose data for the entirety of the winter when the system shuts down. And we also have pretty large gaps each day through most of the growing season. So we wanted to capture a range of gap conditions, and this is probably something that's quite familiar to those of you who are working with AI and capturing a large variety of conditions to train and evaluate the model. And so I guess our questions going into this project were, and I'm going to focus on, were how do we simulate the gaps in the data set, the natural gaps in the data set, such that we can actually evaluate on realistic conditions and know that our model is actually going to perform well when we fill real gaps. Then how do we separate the model selection from the testing? How do we ensure that the model training process is not bleeding into the model evaluation? And then how do we quantify uncertainty with these machine learning models? So for the natural gaps, on the left here, we have the gap. One way of visualizing the gaps in these data sets is with the gap length distribution. So on the left, we have the natural gap length distribution, and you'll see that the vast majority of gaps in these iterative variance data sets are short. So maybe 1/2 hour or 2.5 hours in length. And then we get a long tail distribution with fewer and fewer large gaps. And I guess when we want to be able to evaluate the model by introducing new gaps that we can test on. But we realize when we do that, we're actually going to distort the underlying gap distribution, because we're going to join gaps together and make longer gaps. So if we just naively introduce gaps to test on, you'll get a distribution like this on the right, where we've actually shifted the gap length distribution. We were concerned that would be artificially altering the data set that we want to evaluate on. And so in a nutshell, the way we worked with some computer science students, and was really illustrated the value of these types of collaborations. These computer science students took on this problem really well and came up with a great solution, which really could be described as, first, we weighted the gap length such that we would introduce relatively more short gaps, so that we wouldn't be we would be joining some gaps up, but we'd also be adding an excess abundance of small gaps to maintain the original gap length distribution. And then also they developed an algorithm that would actually minimize the difference between the final and initial gap length distribution. And so this is an algorithm that's a part of the code base that was put together for this project and is available on the GitHub for this project. But essentially, you'll see here we have a set of observed gaps on the left for 2 different sites. And then to maintain a relatively similar final gap length distribution on the right, we have to introduce gap lengths that are kind of biased towards smaller gaps. And so in the end, we're actually able to maintain that kind of natural gap length distribution. So the next question is, again, I think fairly standard stuff for those in machine learning, is thinking about how do we avoid bleeding information into our evaluation. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but basically give you a visual illustration of the process. So we want to just clearly generate and distinguish validation from test sets. So you can imagine our time series starts out like this, where we have observations in gray and real gaps in black. And then we want to generate artificial gaps with the algorithm I just described that introduces these pink squares. And then once we've generated that, we set it aside and we don't work with it at all after that. Or we don't evaluate on that set by itself. And then we use the algorithm again and set aside another, in this case, 10% of the data, and introduce a further set of validation gaps. And we do that 10 times. So we end up with 10 validation sets that contain the natural gaps, the test gaps, and then the validation gaps. And the reason I mention this is just that we want to first identify we want to generate these validation and test sets that we can use to first assess which machine learning approach we should use. So I'm not going to get too much into this because I think it's fairly straightforward. We used kind of a regular regression, neural net, random forest, and boosted random forest model. And then we use different sets of predictors that are drawing on different subsets of the data that's available at each of these sites. But the point here is that from a machine learning perspective, we compared all of these different combinations of predictors and models initially, and did that comparison by generating performance metrics on the validation sets. And we were able to identify that random forest and neural nets were fairly comparable. And this all and baseline predictor set was the best with the lowest errors. And so then using that information, we were able to do a final evaluation, a test evaluation of the models that had first been selected just using the validation sets. And so here we use Taylor diagrams to kind of visualize the overall performance of these models. Here we're comparing the baseline and all predictors for the random forest algorithm. So these gray dots here are the models trained on the baseline predictors. And then we added additional predictors, essentially allowing the model to search across all available predictors. We're seeing a shift towards the star here, which is indicative of an improvement in model performance. The point is really just that we wanted to develop a procedure that would ensure we're not going to, that the development of the model doesn't involve any evaluation on the test set. So we're saving the test set evaluation for the very end when we've taken a subset of the models that we want to evaluate. And then the final part of this is to think about how do we quantify uncertainty on these pieces. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I want to get to the global work. Essentially, some previous work had identified that methane fluxes and CO2 fluxes follow Laplace distributions, and we took average and standard deviation prediction from those 10 trained models for the random forest and the neural net, and use that to parameterize a mean and standard deviation for each prediction. And that allowed us to parameterize this Laplace distribution for the uncertainty. But what we noticed was that when we took these 10 trained models, and we looked at the coverage of the data associated with the raw uncertainties. So how much of the natural observations, the variability in the natural observations was captured within that standard deviation of the model predictions. We found that they were overly sharp, so too confident. So these fully shaded bars at the bottom here are showing the neural network in orange, the random forest in green, and showing that the natural variability present in the data set is actually much wider, much more dispersed, than the uncertainties that we were generating from the 10 ensembled machine learning models. And so we looked into an approach where we could use what we used the approach Platt scaling to rescale those uncertainties to at least match the variability naturally observed in the data set. And you can see here that so on the left, this is I apologize, I don't have the site name here, but this is one of the sites, and you can see there's a very large amount of variability in the natural time series. If we just take the mean and uncertainty of the ensemble machine learning predictions, we see a much narrower uncertainty associated with these predictions. And after calibration, we kind of recapture some of that natural uncertainty. So we can move in closer to the observations. And it has some consequence. So here's 4 different sites of a range of different classes, and you can see that the annual sums for the methane emissions are here, and the uncertainties are in these 2 columns. And you'll see that if we don't do the calibration, these uncertainties are really overly confident. And if we do the calibration, the uncertainties are broadening by a factor of at least 10 in some of these cases. So it really pointed to the fact that we can't that the raw uncertainties from these machine learning ensembles will be too confident and need to be scaled. So I've just talked through these. I guess some future directions are, we didn't really go into more sophisticated machine learning algorithms. So long short-term memory neural networks seem to be promising for time series. We could also consider models that try to learn both the mean and the variance at the same time, so kind of making that calibration procedure obsolete. So Gaussian process models can do that. And then in the long run, the gap filling procedures and also the general ecosystem interpretation of these fluxes is sort of hindered by the fact that we have so much going on in these methane flux signals. So in the future, we might be able to first partition out bubble release transport pathways from, say, diffusive fluxes in that net methane emission signal, and then do the gap filling on those partitioned fluxes. And that might be a way to get a more accurate model. So this code is available through the Stanford ML website. And our hope in the long term is to integrate this into sort of a community standard processing pipeline for methane. And so, yeah, I wanted to move on to this because I think it might be more applicable for this group and interest in the global methane budget. But the second application is really global methane upscaling. And the end goal of this is really to be able to produce something like this 3D model, which was put together by the FLUXCOM group at the Max Planck Institute of Biogeochemistry. It's Marcus Reichstein's group, and they've been taking the FLUXNET-CO2 flux data and using upscaling approaches with machine learning to generate these global surfaces of ecosystem CO2 exchange. And so you'll see here that the indentations into this globe in the dark green colors are places where you have net uptake of carbon dioxide, and this is, I think, for the month of June. Whereas in these arid regions, we actually get net emissions at that time of the year. But this is a dynamic model that I think would be really neat to eventually produce for methane fluxes. And so the upscaling process is really, again, statistically a process to transfer information across scales. And so here we're going from the site level, which is the data that we have, to this global surface. And yeah, our end goal is to generate a global monthly is kind of the standard currently in the field, in the modeling community, methane emissions product for wetlands using this distributed surface network of surface observations. And then, you know, the flux conductivity is what's been generating these CO2 products, and that's kind of been going on since about 2016. And there has been one methane upscaling using eddy covariance, and that's really just focused on northern latitude sites. And so our goal was really to go for a global product. And so maybe revisiting this question of the budget, why do we need these data-driven products? Well, we talked about the fact that the different modeling approaches are generating different totals, which is kind of concerning by itself. But when we dig into that a little bit more deeply, it's also these modeling approaches are just diverging in the way in the spatial pattern that they're predicting. So you'll see that these red colors are indicative of the bottom-up ensemble, the process model ensembles predicting higher emissions in these areas. So you can see that parts of Southeast Asia, some of these high latitude wetland complexes in Central America are all showing higher emissions from these bottom-up ensembles. Whereas the Amazon basin and the Congo and places like Bangladesh are attributed higher emissions from the top-down inversion models. And so kind of using these upscaled models from ground truth data, we're hoping we can do something to validate or interpret, or even eventually benchmark these other global models. And in a nutshell, upscaling involves trying to predict a pattern that we observe at the surface from some underlying processes. So we need to get kind of a globally gridded data sets for the processes that we're interested in, and build some sort of a predictive model, whether it's machine learning or process model, that relates those underlying gridded geospatial predictors to the process, in this case, methane flux. And then we apply that model to a globally gridded set of forcing variables to generate a global visualization. So briefly for model development, we used a larger set of sites this time. So we picked all of the freshwater wetland sites in the FLUXNet methane dataset. So there's 43 of those. You'll see that there's, again, pretty high concentration of sites in North America and Europe, in particular, a lot of data from those California marshes. But we do have sites from each continent, and a few swamps and tropical regions represented. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was establish an appropriate cross-validation scheme to build our model. And so to do that, our first step was to we use what's called leave one site out cross-validation, but we wanted to do a spatially explicit version of that. So rather than treating each individual site as sort of an independent unit, we clustered those sites such that, recognizing that sites that are closer together are more likely to be more similar. And so we clustered with the 300-kilometer buffer. And so that resulted in some groupings of sites and among these different blobs. And so there's 26 clusters in the end that we used for this cross-validation scheme. So, one nice thing was that our gap filling methodology fed right into our upscaling efforts. So we were able to establish we used the gap filled data that we had generated from the previous methodology, but we drew a line at our investigation of gap filling had shown that the performance metrics were pretty much constant until you got up to about 12 days of gaps. And so we drew a threshold of needing at least 1 day in every 2-week period to get to include the data. So any gaps longer than about 2 weeks or 12 days, we discarded. And then I'm not going to get into the predictor data, but we sort of used a kitchen sink approach, which is not the most sophisticated feature selection approach. We sort of set aside our process knowledge and built a catalog of geospatial data sets. So we had things like MODIS, greenness indices, soil properties, other land cover and climate maps. And then we also had the training data at the tower. So things like air temperature, soil temperature, latent heat fluxes measured at the towers themselves. And as long as we were able to map those variables to the globally gridded products, we included them. So just a couple of examples of these. We have weekly data here, which is the finest increment. So we had training data was at the weekly time step. So we have air temperature here for 3 different sites. The darker black colors are where we retained the data. The gray colors are where we discarded it from too much gap filling. Here was a monthly data set. This was MODIS EBI for three different sites. You see these 2 are in the southern hemisphere, so the seasonal signal was inverted. Yeah, so we generated a set of metrics, including things like the mean seasonal cycle and other statistical measures from these raw data. And then we also had some static predictors. So we had things like, the canopy height of the pixel. So we had a range of kind of tall forested canopies down to these marshes, which are pretty short statured canopies. And so, yeah, our cross validation scheme, we involved training the model on all of the data except for one held out cluster. One of those 26 clusters we excluded. So say we might exclude this site in New Zealand, and we train a machine learning model, in this case a random forest, on all of the other data, and then use that model to predict the fluxes at the New Zealand site. And then we would do that iteratively, excluding each of these spatial clusters in the data set until we can build, we'd train the model on all the data, but also evaluate it on all of the available conditions. And we used this forward feature selection. So we repeated that process each time, iterating over all the possible combinations of predictors. So the more predictors you evaluate simultaneously, you get this exponential growth in the number of computations that you need to make. So we limited it quite a bit. So we just considered first a pair of predictors. What were the best first pair of predictors? In this case, we got air temperature and canopy height. And then after that, we sequentially added one single predictor at a time, each time selecting the predictor that minimized the error in the model. And so we ended up with this kind of curve towards less and less error. And we could have included all of these predictors out to here precipitation. But for kind of a more parsimonious model, we picked the predictors that just reduced those first major reductions in error. So I think in the end, we had a model that was 6 predictors. And yes, as you'll see here, these predictors were mostly temperature related. So TA lag 2 is a air temperature with a 2-week lag. Air temperature is TA here. We had this global canopy height predictor. This predictor here is a static climate mean temperature of the driest quarter predictor. We also had this greenness enhanced vegetation index predictor, and it's suggesting there's something about productivity of an ecosystem that is related to methane flux. So I'm going to go through these evaluations pretty quickly, but we did we evaluated the model across 3 kind of temporal components. So we first just compared observed and predicted site mean fluxes, and so that's this figure here. The different colors are different wetland classes, and you'll see there's an outlier site here, this marsh, which we've actually discarded from the rest of the analyses because the fluxes there are so exceptional. But the rest of the sites, the model did fairly well. And we got a R² and Nash Sutcliffe efficiency of that's comparable to some of these other CO2 upscaling approaches. So kind of a moderate model performance. We also broke down, so we looked at the site means, which is sort of important for the annual budget, right? We need to know what's the average flux at a site to get kind of the annual sum. But we also kind of want to capture the seasonality of the system. So we also plot here predicted versus observed monthly seasonal cycles. And so you can see for the tundra, boreal, and temperate regions, we do a reasonably good job where the dashed line here, the one-to-one line, is overlapping pretty well with the seasonal cycles that we're predicting. What really sticks out is the tropical systems. We don't predict the seasonality in the tropics very well at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then another way to evaluate the model is just to kind of do a first cut comparison against some of these other global products. So our model here is in blue, so up methane using this WAD2M wetland data set. And you'll see here that there's very close agreement and overlap with both of these two other estimates, and then pretty close agreement with the bottom-up global carbon projects ensembles at the global scale. So we estimate about 149 teragrams of methane per year globally. That's very close to the bottom-up ensemble estimate. The top-down ensemble, as I mentioned earlier, was 180, which is a bit higher, but it is still within our uncertainty range. And then if we start to kind of parse out what's driving these differences by latitude, you can see that the high latitudes, so these are Arctic latitudes, 60 to 90 degrees north, it's not too much of a difference. Temperate latitudes, again, not too much of a difference. And then these northern latitudes, kind of capturing both of these, pretty similar. And things seem to diverge a bit in the tropics. So this is 60 degrees south to 30 degrees north. And we still get a fairly good agreement with the bottom-up ensemble, but the difference with the top-down really starts to show in the tropics. And then in addition to these annual sum differences, there were also pretty big differences in the spatial patterns. So on the top here, we're just showing our average time series average of methane flux across for 1 month during our upscaling interval. On the bottom here, we're showing the divergence spatially from the bottom-up ensemble. So as I mentioned, we got pretty good agreement between the blue and the black here in the totals. But when we look at the spatial distribution, we actually predict a very different spatial pattern. So in the tropics here, we seemingly underpredict fluxes for almost all of the humid tropics, so the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, Southeast Asia. And then we're compensating for that with relatively higher emissions that we predict for the semi-arid tropics. So parts of the Sahel, Southwest US, this deltaic region of South America, which I'm blanking on the name, and then Central and Southern Australia, which we're sort of probing this a little bit more to understand whether this might be artifacts in our wetland extent product. But yeah, one really clear outcome of this is this uncertainty about the importance of the semi-arid versus the humid tropics for methane. And then we did a little bit of additional evaluation, looking at some additional test sites that appeared after we did all this training and modeling. And we found, again, same story. The model performance here in the straight line is agreeing with the points, the data, for most of these sites outside of the tropics. But in the tropics, we are not able to reproduce the seasonal pattern accurately. You'll see we kind of predict a straight line in this area of Peru, but there's actually a strong seasonal signal. So really quickly, something on future directions. And I picked this picture from NASA, from the Okavango Delta, because I think I just really wanted to drive home the idea that we have such a rudimentary understanding of wetlands in the tropics. And they're so, in many ways, so different from the systems that we're studying and have studied so much in the high latitudes. So this is a, sorry, slightly blurry figure, but we can sort of look at it with a broad brush. This is a map of tower constituencies. So one thing that's emerging in the machine learning field for these spatial prediction tasks is that we need to evaluate the spatial representativeness of the data set. So we've come back to again and again the fact that we have very few sites in the tropics. And what that means, if you define a spatial constituency based upon the predictors in the model, like how similar is a particular tower in terms of these predictors to other parts of the world, you'll see that there's like 3 colors that dominate basically the entirety of the tropics. So there's this pink color, which is associated, I think, with this site in Indonesia, this tropical peat swamp forest. There's this red site in Botswana, which is a semi-arid, hydrologically active region, which generalizes kind of all over these semi-arid regions. And then there's this purple color, which is sort of a transitional site here in the Pantanal, Brazilian Pantanal. It's a wet savanna. But the point, you can sort of quickly see that our ability to distinguish fine differences in the tropics is really, really limited. And it's also where 60% of the global methane total is for wetlands is being emitted. So I think a large part of the take home from this study was really the real need for more data in the tropics before these globally upscaled products can be useful for validating predictions there. So this is kind of the data side. And then the other side is really advances in machine learning. And so we used an entirely data-driven approach, just using a random forest and a data-driven feature selection approach. But some scientists at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, Zhuzhan Zhuan and Qing Zhu, have been working on a physically constrained machine learning model that is first, in addition to training the model with an algorithm like a neural net or a random forest, it's also incorporating information about the variable importance rankings that are seen in the observations. So you'll see here on the right, air temperature is by far the most important variable when we do some sort of a variable importance ranking in the data. And if we just use a regular LSTM without this kind of process constraint, the model doesn't really reproduce that importance of this particular air temperature predictor. But the causal LSTM actually forces the model to weight these predictors more, or these variables more in the model structure, and retains that variable importance, and it propagates through to more accurate predictions and quite different global upscale predictions. So we're pretty excited about working with them to further improve the kind of machine learning part of the upscaling. Yeah, so to finish up, I just really wanted to emphasize again that this data is available. Some of the code for what we've done is already available, and it's definitely a big data set that you can explore with machine learning. There's a lot of new community efforts around this activity, and we're thinking about how do we build towards a FLUXNet methane version 2. So very interested if you'd like to contribute to that. And then there's a ton more science that we can do with this. A lot of what we've done so far is kind of purely data driven and not really balancing our process understanding with the data. So I think I just squeezed things in. I'll finish up now. Thank you.